Thank you for joining. Thank you for being here for today's In Conversation, which is focused on the justice system and looking to think big picture about how we might influence a justice system that serves and meets the needs of victims and survivors. So let me start by doing an acknowledgement and say that I'm coming from Wurundjeri lands and part of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne, Naarm. And I'd just like to pay respects to elders past and present and recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders work ceaselessly and tirelessly to address inequalities, and we stand with them to do so, particularly in relation to justice outcomes for children and young people. I'd also like to honour the lived and living experience of all victims and survivors of child sexual abuse, harnessing all ages, cultures, abilities and backgrounds, and just recognise that we're all here to recommit ourselves to substantially addressing the harm of child sexual abuse, and recognise that there are children and young people being harmed today, and dedicate ourselves to doing all we can to promote their effective protection and care. And today I'd also like to recognise that we're in the middle of a national conversation about domestic and family violence, and recognise that that there is a great deal of interest, engagement and power in the conversation of people leaning in to a conversation about this really challenging area, noting that there are children often in the background of family and domestic violence, and that child sexual abuse isn't a separate issue, it's a very connected issue. So just recognising and welcoming a national conversation about harm and preventing harm. If you don't know, the National Centre was a recommendation of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, and our focus is on, we're the only national centre focusing solely on child sexual abuse, but across the whole of life. So keen to engage with and learn from and elevate the voices of victims and survivors of all ages, life stages and communities. We're interested in prevention, and we're interested in better responses across the board. And so we commission research, we build the capability of workers and organisations, and we raise community awareness. And we're completely delighted to have you all joining us today. Can I just say that sometimes these conversations are challenging, and so we just remind you that you should look after yourself as you listen and engage with this. There are ways to access support, and those are lines that we would recommend and encourage you to use if you need to, because these conversations aren't easy. They're confronting and challenging, and we have a way of that. And the system and our support system in the Australian community has ways of providing support, and these are the ones that we encourage you to use. Thanks. All right, let me introduce this amazing panel that has kindly come to join us today. We are delighted to have them, and we are pretty excited, in fact, to be introducing them. So firstly, let me introduce Associate Professor Jodi Death, who's located in the School of Justice in Queensland at the University of Technology. And Jodi's research interest is in child sexual abuse in institutional care, and this includes identifying and responding to the voices and needs of survivors, and developing an understanding of historic pedophile networks. So Jodi, welcome, and thank you for spending time with us today.
Thank you.
Secondly, we have Hanina Rind, who's a proud Yamatji Badimaya woman and a member of the National Centre's First Nations College. She's an experienced personal injury lawyer with a focus on institutional abuse, police torts and coronial inquests. Hanina, thank you very much for joining us. Malika Elizabeth Reese is a member of the National Centre's Survivor-Led Adult College. Malika is a speaker, writer, musician and storyteller, performer for over 20 years. Malika's in the process of publishing a family memoir of 6 women in her family, going back 6 generations, to gently address such topics as eating disorders, body acceptance and child sexual abuse, Malika's a friend of the National Centre, and we're delighted to have you, Malika. Thank you. And Renee Handsaker is the practice lead at Open Circle, the Centre for Innovative Justice at the RMIT University. Renee is a highly skilled facilitator with over 15 years' experience facilitating restorative processes in response to sexual assault and child sexual abuse. A key part of Renee's work is facilitating and healing and acknowledgement processes between survivors of institutional child sexual abuse and the leaders of those institutions. So you can see from those introductions, welcome Renee, you can see from those introductions that we are pretty privileged to have this group of experts with us. So let me go to some questions straight away and just remind people who are listening and participating in the webinar that if you have questions, you're welcome to put them in the Q&A and we'll find a way of weaving them into the conversation. But I'd like to start by putting Jodi on the spot and say to her, Jodi, is the system deeply flawed for victims and survivors, the justice system? What can you tell us about that and about your research?
So the short answer is yes, absolutely. But I'd like to premise that with an understanding that certainly since the 1990s and prior to that and through to the 2000s, we've actually seen some changes that were meant to be improvements to the criminal justice system to be better accommodating for victim survivors. And this is everything from policing through to the way that courts do things and provide better support. We still know, though, that there are a high level of attrition, so cases that don't make it through the criminal justice system at every level, starting with police. And before that, before things even get to the criminal justice system, we still know that child sexual abuse is massively underreported. And there's still not a lot of motivation for victim survivors to go to court or to report to police. And then when you get to court, we know that a lot of cases fall over there. We know that conviction levels, although up and down, largely, we know that there's not a lot of convictions that happen in the end. And we know that sentences can be thought of inadequate. Comparatively, I mean, in the UK, as I understand it, convictions sit around 1% for sexual violent offences. So we're slightly better than other parts of the world, but we still have a long way to go for a system where survivors report high levels of re-traumatization, low levels of motivation to engage with the system, which is the backstory to, yes, we have a system that is extraordinarily problematic for victim survivors.
So if I go to each of the panel members and ask you, maybe starting with you, Hanina, what do you see as the biggest obstacles? What are the obstacles that are stopping people go to use the justice system?
Yeah, good question. I guess when it comes to when it comes to First Nations and Aboriginal people in this country, I think, and most of you would know this, the police and the carceral system in general can be very dangerous for us. It's life or death. So I think when it comes to survivors and what survivors can do to find a way to come forward and find safe places to disclose, I think it's about investing in healing-centered programs. I think the carceral system is severely failing, and we've seen this. You know, we don't need to go into the amounts of deaths that happen in custody and the effects that it has on families across the country, particularly for Aboriginal people. But I think we do most definitely need support systems that are well funded and legal services that are well funded for survivors to actually go to, sit down, have that, I guess, culturally safe and trauma-informed environment where they can safely disclose. And then what that service does with that is, wrap around that particular survivor and assist them in the right way. I guess sometimes we'll find that survivors may not want to, have any or go through a criminal process, particularly if it's historical. But even if it is something that's, an abuse that has happened, more recently. So I think having a bit of a transformative justice approach, or an approach where those types of systems may not be involved at all, is probably something that we need to look into.
Hanina, thank you. I think, here's one we prepared earlier, which is Renee, who works in this space completely, and can tell us a bit about her work in that. So what do you see as the obstacles, and what are you finding in your work, Renee?
Yeah, thanks for the segue, Hanina. Yeah, I mean, I agree with the other panelists that it is deeply flawed, and I think there are other options and opportunities for justice doing that, transformative, restorative justice pathways that we know a lot about, the government knows a lot about. There's been multiple inquiries recommending these pathways, but they're not being taken up. But essentially, I think that one of the biggest problems is that the criminal justice system only offers one version of justice, and that's really interested in what's the law that's been broken, who broke that law, and what punishment do they deserve. That's really all it's interested in, which has got nothing to do with the needs or interests of victim survivors. So if we're looking at a restorative or a transformative justice approach, we're really interested in what's the harm that's being caused, who has been hurt, what's the harm, and what are the needs that's arisen from this harm. So what's the person who's harmed, what's their needs and interests, what does justice mean to them? And then the other questions we'd be asking after that is, well, who has the obligations to respond to these needs and interests? Who needs to be involved? And how are we going to respond to these needs and interests? And so then who needs to be involved? What's an appropriate, supported, meaningful process that responds to both the needs and interests of people who have been harmed, victim survivors, and the obligations of the people who have done the hurting and the harm? So very different justice pathways, really interested in, and ends up with very different outcomes and results too. So really about expanding, I think, the notions of justice as well.
Yes, and the needs of both the victims and survivors, and the rights of the person who's being prosecuted. Malika, what are your thoughts on the obstacles from your perspective for using the criminal justice system?
Well, again, I acknowledge that it is deeply flawed, and it's not about changing, it's about reimagining, the whole system. Having prosecuted my perpetrator, the first time I went to the police, it just felt so cold and awful that I sort of dropped the whole case, and I only went back in again after my daughter turned 4, same age I was when he first got his hands on me. So I would say that it's completely not trauma informed. If you had somebody there to support, survivors who understood the system and who understood, who communicate with the police, because the police just have no idea. And there's no one sort of place to go where there is a group of people who are trauma informed and who can support the survivors and who can help navigate the very complex and very cold, very fraught, judicial system, which is definitely, it's not really helping anyone. It's not helping the survivors at the moment. So you have to have, a lot of strength and support in order to get through it. So I would love to see, actually a dedicated, trauma court, or, an actual people that are called in. We've got somebody who's, saying that they've got issues, that they want to report, and you could call someone and say, yep, let me help you to navigate that with the system.
Okay, so can I ask a little bit about what happens, or what your impression is about what happens before someone gets to the criminal justice system? If we just think about, because all of you have talked about the sort of challenges in engaging with the system, and it's particularly kind of unilateral focus on one kind of part of the justice, and not on the trauma, not on the victim, or that's potentially how it feels. That might be a bit black and white. But one of the things that I'm quite interested in is what happens upstream before someone decides to go to the criminal justice system, and what do you think moderates people's decision about whether they'll go at all? Because that goes back to Jodi's original point, and maybe I'll start with you, Jodi. Goes back to Jodi's original point about there's very low numbers of people who even approach the system, let alone successfully prosecute an outcome. So, Jodi, what's your view about upstream? What are the sorts of things that influence people before they get to the justice system?
So the thing that we know about victim survivors, and this particularly comes from research that Professor Kelly Richards and I have done around victim survivors' perspectives. Victim survivors are generally far less punitive than the general community. They often are not directly seeking punishment. What they're absolutely wanting is that perpetration doesn't happen again, that there is protection for the rest of the community. Now, that's not to say there's not a punitive element, but mostly it's about wanting accountability and wanting there to be some sense of responsibility for perpetrators. So what happens upstream is often a whole lot of work around building the resilience and building the determination and probably exhausting other efforts to ensure that that happens. Now, that's not across the board, but mostly what we know, what's motivating victim survivors is that there is a massive reduction in perpetration and the community is kept safe.
Yeah. Is that from your perspective, Malika, is that what was in your mind when you
100%.
the system? Yeah.
It was the fact that I found out that my perpetrator, Richard Peter Maddox, was named Senior Citizen of the Year in Armidale, and he was still teaching children. And I just thought, no, I have to do whatever I can to protect others from going through what I've gone through. And that's part of the reason I had the name suppression order dropped. I just wanted to name and shame. I didn't want to hide behind that, order that I needed to be protected. He needed to be outed. So that was what I needed.
Okay. And was it worth it?
Was it worth it? 100% it was worth it. He's not teaching children anymore, at least not, he's not allowed to. And we got his name put in the Sydney Morning Herald and on the front page of the Armidale Express. And I didn't need an apology from him. Yeah. I just needed him to not be able to do this again.
Yeah. Is that one, Renee, in your work, do you find, what are the sorts of motivations, just picking up on both of those comments, what are the motivations you see upstream before people consider the justice system?
Yeah, absolutely agree with that. I think, so what we often talk about is a victim survivor often, when they've experienced harm, has justice needs and interests, really. So this might be a need to tell their story in their own words, in their own way, to be listened to. It might be that they have a need to be validated and acknowledged, like, yes, we believe you, yes, this happened. It might be that they're seeking some form of accountability that's actually different to punishment. There might be a tangible action to show that someone is taking responsibility, but it might not be that they want their family member imprisoned. It might be that they want to ask the person who has hurt them a question about a why or a something that kind of is on a loop in their brain, and they need the answer to that question. Yeah. But it might be that the criminal justice system isn't interested in answering that question, so it never gets answered through that process.
Yeah.
Or it might be that they have a need, particularly when it's within a family, they have a need to negotiate, okay, who comes to the family Christmas? Or what happens when we meet each other in the supermarket? Like that's, and so often people are funneled into the criminal justice system because that's the only version of a response that's on offer. But if any of these responses were on offer upstream, it might actually be meeting the needs of people and the interests of people, and actually not require, a criminal justice involvement.
So it does go back to what people are needing, in individual victims and survivors are needing. And I think what we're hearing is that the current criminal justice system is not meeting those needs. Hanina, I suspect when you talk about the dangerous decision, a life or death decision for an Indigenous person to approach the justice system, that's a huge part of their thinking and preparation, and potentially an obstacle for coming into the system. What are the sorts of things that, are there any additional things that First Nations people are looking for in your experience in terms of their motivation for approaching the justice system?
Yeah, I think most definitely alternative approaches. And I guess, from our perspective, that would be community-driven approaches to violence prevention, and ways that can potentially engage perpetrators, and whether that is in alternative programs outside of the criminal justice system, and looking at that, the effects of what that could have for the broader community, leads to a kind of transformative process. I think, it goes down to self-determination again. I know we've heard this quite often, and yeah, just having that culturally grounded approach to justice. Sometimes, like I said, when you have a situation where a perpetrator may be, and most likely is, known to the family or a family member, disclosure becomes an issue, because that could mean that perpetrator could potentially die in prison, and that's not necessarily what people are wanting in a community. Of course, we want accountability, and we want that person to be removed from situations where they can perpetrate.
Yeah.
But I think having that non-violent approach is a better alternative.
So we've talked about, some of the options upstream, some of the understandings of what victims and survivors want, and I'm sure there's many, many others that our audience or people that we know might add to that list. But people then do come to the criminal justice system, which we know is flawed. And, there's a question that's come through around, well, do victims and survivors really know about those challenges before they engage? Like, how could we be preparing them? Malika, did you know? Did you know what it was going to be like?
I was very lucky to have gotten free counselling with a sexual assault service here in Wollongong, and they brought somebody in to talk to us all to say how difficult the process was, years before I even went down that path, to say that there were judges who would collude with the defence lawyers to blow the survivors' stories out of the water, and how, fraught the system was, how absolutely against, how hard it would be to, but I still needed to try, because, the more that we all try, the more we can try to change the system. So
yeah, thank you.
strength.
I see, Jodi, that you were nodding there. Are there ways of people, victims and survivors, finding out, or do we prepare them enough for what the challenges might be in the system?
I'm going to say that varies widely based on what support victim survivors have in their lives.
Right.
Malika was really fortunate to have access to a service, but those services are so underfunded regionally, are so underfunded even in major cities, that your access to have a support person. And there's a whole debate around, when you take a disclosure, do you tell a victim survivor how difficult the system will be? Because we don't want to discourage people from going through there, but we do want to forewarn people what it's going to be like, and where's the kind of ethical responsibility. I don't think we're clear on this, and I absolutely don't think that we prepare victim survivors well for a system that, it's slow. It can take up to 2 years, and a lot of things can change in there. You're not actually, you're a witness for the state, essentially, and the state can do whatever they want with that. And that might mean, even despite the best intentions, changes in solicitors at public prosecutions, changes in support workers along the way, changes in locations. Like, there's so much that's out of your control. It's really difficult to actually prep for the uncertainty of that. And so I don't think that we do it well. I think there's a lot of people trying really hard to, in really complex and difficult situations.
Thanks, Jodi. And Hanina, do you think that that if, as people come into the system, is there enough, like what kind of training is there for lawyers and for judges and for those that are walking along, you know, who are doing their day job, which is the justice system, around trauma and also around cultural safety?
Yeah, look, it's very lacking. I think, you know, the players within this system most definitely need more training, but at times I think is training the solution. I mean, we do need to go back a step. I think within law school, well, and even high school for that matter, there needs to be a lot more understanding around these important issues. And I think most definitely in law school, you know, we don't get taught anything about trauma-informed practice. Often people, and it is true, you know, we will say we aren't social workers, but part of our role as a lawyer is almost a pseudo social worker, because we're often at times the first person that someone is disclosing, you know, such a horrific part of their life to for the first time. And most of the time I've seen a lot of lawyers completely incapable of dealing with that themselves. I think what we do need is more support within the legal system, and this goes for companies and organizations in general, so that we are then, you know, equipped with those resources. I know when I've spoken to survivors and they've disclosed for the first time, I will give them a bit of a breakdown and a bit of an understanding of, yes, the system is actually very difficult. You are going to be faced with a lot of hurdles. There are going to be times when you will think, I shouldn't have done this. But, you know, I often try and, you know, add on to that what you've done, just disclosing to me, is a huge step. And if this is where you want to leave it, that's absolutely fine with you. I think the other major issue, especially within personal injury and abuse law, from, you know, a common law claim or a civil claim, is a lot of companies and law firms are, I mean, let's face it, they're more interested in billable hours. And so, you know, you're trying to condense time over the phone with a client to less than an hour or an hour. And so it's I think there's a lot of problems within it. We need to have more trauma-informed practice within law firms, most definitely. I mean, that's how I practice within my own practice. But I think there's a lot of points, a lot of ways that we can train people within the system and support the actors within the system, I think.
So this goes to a question that's come through really, and I'll just go to you, Renee, because I think that you might have particular lens and filter on this, but this idea about how bound the legal system is. So how can you build the time Hanina's talking about? You know, how can you give people time to think, which we know is a really important part of a trauma responsive sort of approach. You know, knowledge, commitment for to allow the survivors to drive it at their pace in the way they want to drive it, when we know that the billable hours or the court systems are, you know, don't respect that. What's your advice around that and your learning yourself in your work about those sorts of challenges inside the legal system?
I mean, I would agree. I'm not 100% convinced that trauma-informed training is the answer, because you know, as Jodi was talking about, it's essentially kind of the state is a big beast where things move and change. And I know a whole bunch of players within that system who are very kind, very thoughtful, very gentle, and that still doesn't necessarily impact the experience of someone going through the system. You know, a restorative justice lens sometimes talks about, you know, the state has stolen the conflict, you know, and then the state decides what to do with that conflict. So sometimes the trauma-informed lens is not necessarily going to change that dramatically. It's, you know, certainly it might change the flavor a little bit, but yeah, I think it's really important that any of the kind of the stakeholders or the players in it are able to have those kind of options talks with victim survivors around, this is the pathway that you're on at the moment, this is the outcome, is that what you're seeking, or is it something different? So being able to really just expand the options and opportunities for people, I think is such an important aspect, that they get to be the expert in their own lives, they make the decisions, and that those key players in the criminal justice system aren't assuming that kind of paternalistic position and making decisions on behalf of people. Yeah.
Renee, brilliant. Thank you. Jodi, you mentioned previously about how it depends on the state and whether things are in, available and rural and regional, and in terms of services and availability of resources. There's a question in the chat around, well, how does someone find those kind of resources? Do you have anything that you can help with that?
I just want to jump back, if I can, for a moment.
Please,
and say, I guess in response to Renee, that like I 100% agree that maybe trauma-informed training isn't the whole answer, but one of the things that we do know is that even if the outcome is bad, how you get to that outcome counts. And if you get that to the outcome and victim survivors feel heard and they feel supported and they feel as if they've had the opportunity to have their say, and they feel as if, even if legally there hasn't been a result that they were expecting, but they feel believed along the way by even a handful of professionals, that can make a significant difference to recovery. So I don't think that trauma-informed practice is going to save this system, but I think that it can improve experiences for people, and maybe that's the best that we can get in this particular, the stuff around this is not actually a justice system, it's a legal system. And we just need to stop referring to it as justice because it's just about the law. To come back to the actual question, though, around finding services, I mean, Google is a magnificent thing. There's this huge rise in, I guess, services that are offered online, and even in communities where there are long wait lists to access sexual assault services, or you have to travel long distances to access sexual assault services. The space of the internet is providing something that is probably not going to be adequate or great for everybody, but it's something that's there. And sometimes what we need is just what's going to get us through till we can get to a point where we can access a service that is more meaningful. The bottom line, though, is that we need more funding for more services across the country. Like, you find what works for you, and what works for you may not be a sexual assault service specifically. What works for you may be a online counselling forum, or it may be that women's group in your town, or it may be the collaborative support of a group of friends that can help carry you through that. And I would suggest that seeking out connections more broadly. Trauma happens in relationships and it's healed in relationships. So finding those outside of just professional services is really challenging, but also I think really beneficial for people, which is a complete non-answer to the problem.
No, I think it is an answer.
But it's a huge problem.
Well, it's a huge problem, and it sounds to me like the audience who's listening today is kind of focusing in on, well, how do we get the sort of, where do we find the people that can walk us through the stand with us when you do need resilience, and you do need, you're having those challenging times in a legal sort of journey pathway, etc. And how do you get through that? Malika, how did you find your resources?
Well, as Jodi said, I actually was on the waiting list for about 4 or 5 years before my name came up. And yeah, I just was, well, I've taken this long to do the healing. What's another 4 or 5 years to wait to get to a counsellor? So I guess with the internet, as you say, Jodi, that there are those resources and those supports that aren't just necessarily counselling, but forums, and I think that they're invaluable. And also, using art, and I use music a lot to heal and to join musical groups. That just worked for me, but I would certainly say just to expand your support networks and look outside, what you to look for your healing.
So let me just kind of put a line in the sand here, just to say that we are talking in two sort of areas. One is, how can we invent a restorative system? How can we, you know, we have to get rid of the current one and start again. But we're also talking about how do we manage the current system, because there's a whole lot of realists around the table who are like, well, you know, no one's going to dissolve the current legal system. It's too much. So what do we do? How do we approach that? And are the restorative practices, the approaches that you know, unique lawyers like Hanina are taking to create more time for people, so on? You know, how are those things? Like, what else do we need? So we'll come to the big framing about what it could really look like. But in terms of what happens now and what's now, what are your thoughts about a system that, additions to the existing system that we haven't already spoken about? What are other things that we could be doing with the existing system that would create more justice and less legal?
I have huge thoughts. I can leap in. I feel like Hanina might have some really great things to say in this space as well.
Come to Hanina, yep, absolutely.
So, we absolutely can go to a specialised court system where we have juries that are not just randoms drawn from the community who could have any perspective on sexual assault, which we still know communities' attitudes towards sexual assault are often limited and problematic and cause harmful responses to victim survivors. We can have specialised training for judges and magistrates. So I also think we probably need a third outcome. So we have guilty or not guilty. And I think probably what we can have in there is a not proven beyond reasonable doubt that isn't quite the balance of probabilities in the civil system, but just says there is something substantial here. In terms of a legal outcome, we can't prove it to the highest possible standard, but that's not actually saying we don't believe the victim as well. And that's incredibly problematic. They've had it in Scotland for a while, but it introduces a whole different range of challenges, but there is lots of adaptations I think that we can consider. But first and foremost should be specialised courts. We absolutely should have specialised courts, specialised juries, specialised judges.
Yep. What do you think, Hanina?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's you know, one potential option. But yeah, I guess it goes back to what I said earlier around allocating those resources towards, yeah, not only just the education and training in specialised areas, but mental health services, addiction treatment. Like, there's so many things that we need to kind of improve to support the survivor, to believe the survivor, but also work towards a society that's not violent, which means addressing perpetrator actions. And so, you know, these services need to be available for them as well. And yeah, I guess the specialised court, it would be a very interesting thing. It would be really good to look into that Scottish way that they've done it there, and having kind of a third threshold, I guess, or outcome, I should say. Yeah. But it would be very interesting to see that happen in Australia. I think we're always lagging behind here in so many ways.
So that's Jodi, that's a civil, like a civil action outcome. Is that what you're saying?
Look, it's been a very long time since I looked at that particular piece of legislation. I don't think that it's a blanket solution, and we should talk about it coming in. There's a whole other range of problems that come with that. But I think the idea of being able to communicate to victims that there is some level of belief there, and not just it's not guilty, meaning, you know, however you want to frame it, there's the victim survivor walks out feeling disbelieved, right?
Sure.
And that's problematic. So how can we adapt that? But what then does that mean for consequences for perpetrators? Does that mean therapeutic intervention for perpetrators as opposed to criminal sanction? Like, I'm completely with Hanina. We need way more therapeutic interventions with perpetrators than we have. I'd have to dig around in the legislation to look at the Scottish. It's niggling the back of my head.
Thank you. But it does come to this issue about what back to the motivation about what a victim and survivor wants out of the system. You know, is it a punishment, or is it what is it? And it's back to this idea about being believed and validated, which I think probably is a lot of your work, Renee, in terms of the mediation and what victims and survivors might want to hear from an institution or from a perpetrator. Is that the sort of work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so my background is a counsellor originally, and did a lot of work in a counselling context responding to survivors of sexual assault and child sexual abuse. And just, you know, through that kind of moving to facilitating restorative processes and drawing on what Jodi said, you know, that trauma happens in relationship and is healed in relationships. It's so true. And it's almost like we have kind of these two pathways on offer. We have sort of a criminal justice process, or you can go get counselling for your trauma. And there's a real kind of third pathway that is just unexplored or not known about, which is really about facilitating a response to the needs that have arisen in a way that really honours the harm and the relationships that the harm has occurred between. So that might also be not just necessarily with the person responsible or even the institution that has some obligations to respond. It might be perhaps even with a parent who didn't act protectively, or, you know, the harm sort of has tentacles everywhere. So it really is about where does that harm exist and what needs to happen to respond to that. So
yeah. Thank you. So here we have another example of the need for there to be individual, thoughtful approaches to a victim and survivor to understand what's happened to them, for them to be validated and believed and responded to compassionately. And then, you know, how would you like to take this forward? And our system isn't doing that, I take it, from what you've all said. So it feels like there is, you know, this. We touched on police before, and we've talked a lot about the legal system. But, you know, if each of you had something that you would say to police first and then the court second, what would you be saying? Because you've all experienced the legal system and the police response system in a different way. What would you be saying? Because I think it's really important that we kind of get down to what actions need to happen now for people to change. Can I start with you, Malika?
As I touched on before, I would love there to be a trauma-informed team that could go in and sit with survivors while they give statements to the police, even if they were dialed in, or just somebody who was more informed, because I'm sure a lot of these police officers are just sort of like taken aback, like, oh, I don't know what to do with you, oh, awkward. And so to have a team of people who actually understand and can support survivors through it. And again, I know that it's complicated, it can people off, but I would love as well to see the resources online, or to be able to give them to the survivors to say, look, this is what you will, you know, might expect. This is the things that, as Jodi said as well, everything that Jodi said actually happened to me, or the changes of legal teams, or the changes of location of where the court happened. There was so much that I had no idea, and I would have loved. So I would love people to understand that, even to the point of having to phone tap, you know, the perpetrator, and to make sure, oh, you're not allowed to lead the perpetrator and ask them specific questions. They have to volunteer that they abused you, and you know, it's fraught. So I would love to see just some people there who are specifically there to help people navigate through the legal system. I think that's something that's absolutely doable now.
Malika, thank you. So Hanina, and what would you be saying?
To be very honest with you, I'm, like I said earlier, very reluctant for us to go directly to the police. I don't think that they're a safe alternative for us, or safe option, I should say. Often I think a community, a community response is, would be the better alternative if you did have the right types of people, well trained and able to support you. I think, when I have had clients who have gone to the police, and this is with civil claims, I've often told them, look, you don't have to, but if you do, be prepared for most likely a police officer to not even believe you. And that's happened every single time. And so, and that's quite a few times that survivors will come back to me and say, hey, this was just the most horrible experience. I wish I never did it. And it's horrible because we are in a system where there, like we said, there's the courts and the police, and these are the only kind of things that we have. But I do think that there needs to be other options that are available to people, because they're just dangerous for us.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Thank you. Renee, what's your thoughts about that?
I mean, I would like to see the government, particularly the Victorian government, act on the Victorian Law Reform Commission recommendations, particularly around restorative justice. So I know we're talking about reimagining the justice system, but there's no reason that restorative pathways can't sit alongside as a complementary alternative or as well as a criminal justice system. And so we need legislation in Victoria. We have people who want this option, and we don't have legislation, which sometimes can create a barrier for us being able to provide it. So
Yeah.
what I would like to see.
Yeah. And our online community is talking quite a bit about victim support advocates and the Victorian system, which, is part of that. Jodi, what do you think from the police point of view, from your research and engagement with victims and survivors?
So I absolutely agree. I cannot emphasize how much I agree out there that there are police officers that don't believe victims, that handle things really poorly, that cause significant amounts of re-traumatization. I also see a lot of police out there who do believe victims and get really frustrated with systems and really struggle with the idea that it gets to court and it doesn't go anywhere, or they can't get the evidence they need. And two, they also interview in ways that aren't trauma informed because they're terrified that the court will throw out their evidence because it looks like they've been empathetic, or it looks like they've been sympathetic, or it looks like they've cared about the victim, and they have to be impartial and distant, and that comes off as cold and gets terrible evidence. Because it's really difficult as a victim survivor to share and to even, you're under so much stress in that situation. The brain isn't designed to recall that information, right? So the biggest thing I would say is that taking a trauma-informed approach, which doesn't mean you are a soft pushover, but if you understand the way that trauma functions in the brain and you understand what it means to take a trauma-informed approach, you will actually get better evidence. You will get better testimony, you will get better recall, you will get better leads to be able to follow out of that. Taking a trauma-informed approach, I think, needs to be understood as actually getting better evidence. And if you don't care about people, but you care about evidence, then it's still the thing that you should do. It's a crappy motivation, but it's still the thing you should do because you'll get better evidence. And then when we get to courts, we need to understand that compassion and kindness don't mean that you're not impartial, doesn't mean that you suspend your brain or your critical thinking. It just means that you understand that you don't want to cause further trauma to people, and you don't want to create further harm. And we need to create systems that replicate that and understand what victim survivors actually want, which means at the tail end of that, we do need better programs for perpetrators. We do need better programs to support victim survivors, not only through the system, but post the system, because most child sexual abuse still happens in families. So you still have this wide network of people, the ripple effect of harm, and we need to support not just primary victims, but secondary victims. communities in coming to understand the impacts of child sexual abuse. That's what I think.
Thank you. I would just like to ask people to think a little bit more about the restorative pathways. We are getting lots of engagement around that in the chat. So and what they might look like and how people might access those ideas or those restorative. Can I just also say that we had one of these webinars earlier on this year, and you can see that online, and all of actually the ones that we've had, these panel discussions online. The one that we had earlier this year was with over 300 people attending. It was about disclosures in children and young people, and it was particularly about some of the challenges, including some of the challenges in this evidence issue that you're raising, Jodi, and about, and Malika raised too, and about the relational options that you have with children to take time to help them with their telling their story. So, if people are interested, particularly in children and young people and disclosures, that's a really useful, some amazing experts on that panel. I encourage you to have a look at that. What does restorative justice pathways mean, Renee? What does it mean?
Good question. I mean, I think, well, I suppose our service would really, as a starting point, really be interested in what does that mean to the victim survivor? What are the needs and interests that have arisen from that harm? And really, what's possible as a response that feels safe, that feels supported, that feels meaningful, where they're, again, the experts in their own lives, they're building their capacity and resources to be able to respond to the problems that they're facing, that honours the relationships and the people that they care about, what's important to them. So really, it's a very flexible approach. We never rush a restorative response. It's very slow, very thoughtful, very careful, to make sure that we're really safe about how we engage people.
So it's what it means to them.
Essentially, yeah. What it means to them within the realms of what's possible. So we can't ever coerce or force anyone to participate. It can only ever be voluntary. We have a really important principle of do no further harm, which guides us the whole way. So it really, what's possible is also a consideration.
What do you reflect on, Hanina, when you hear the term restorative justice? What does that mean for you and from the perspective of your work?
Yeah, I think exactly what Renee just said, and ensuring that there is all these types of services are culturally appropriate and have that understanding around how these colonial racist systems has affected us as well, because that adds an additional layer to how we respond to things, and then how we get support from these types of services as well. I think that these types of options would be met with open arms for most communities, because we've seen the carceral system is a failure. It doesn't work. Perpetrators go into prison and there's barely any reform. People aren't coming out completely changed. You may have one person that may come out completely changed, but you'll have 1,000 others that haven't. In fact, they'll probably, have experienced further harm themselves in prison. So these aren't the options that I think should be available. There needs to be others, and most definitely, culturally safe and trauma informed, of course.
Thanks, Hanina. Malika, what would restorative justice mean to you and to your family?
Oh, it's just big. So I've just been sitting here thinking about what restorative justice full stop would look like, imagining if there was something like a child abuse justice network where you could go and just that's the first place you go to find out, well, what is it that you want? Do you want just an apology? Do you want, counseling? Do you want to go through the criminal system? And how would that look it would be amazing, you know, that just goes out and out to help bring in the families and the people that are also affected by, you know, survivors' trauma, and then how that affects our relationships, and in order to try to just be cycle breaks to stop that, you know, to pick up our children to prevent further harm. I just don't think there's not nearly enough. Could we just sell those AUKUS submarines, put that all into just funding families, you know, counseling and just support networks? Because, you know, when you look back, you can see the ripples. You can try to understand, well, the trauma that, you know, that made that person, you know, offend, that made that person. And so life's not black and white. It's very complicated. And so I would just like to see, it's no brainer, just more funding for families and to find out what people need in order to heal.
Yeah. And it's back to the support and services that are not just for the person who's experienced harm, but the ripple effect around them.
Yeah, and also, and I've said for decades as well that we do, I know it's controversial, but, you know, Jodi's saying, Renee as well, that we need to actually have services to stop the perpetrators from offending. If they have any, you know, any smidge of sort of awareness that what they're doing is wrong, and then they want help to stop that, well, you're protecting the children. And so we, you know, it's not taboo to help them as well. It's what we need as a whole society. It's, you know, holistically to help change our society.
Thanks, Malika. I'm going to come back to you, Jodi, and ask, you know, are there other things from a restorative justice point of view that we haven't touched on in that conversation there? And then I'd like to talk to you about law reform.
So I think that if our ultimate aim is to prevent further offending, then we need to understand that not all perpetrators are the same. And there is this idea out there that perpetrators are compulsive and they're fixated and they will endlessly offend. And it's just not accurate when you look at the typology of offending that happens. So if we're going to ask people to change their offending behaviours, then we need to acknowledge that the carceral system is a centuries-old failed experiment where you can't ask people to go into environments where they're more harmed and dehumanized and come out better. We are compounding the problem with the way that we do incarceration across the Western world. And if we're asking people to change, we need to give them hope that they can change and hope that they can move into a different position. Now, that doesn't mean that they should not have ongoing accountability throughout their lives, but it does mean that we have to start fundamentally with accountability, but accountability with the hope that something can be different. And that something that can be different doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be restored to the victim survivor themselves, but they need to be restored into some kind of community. And Circles of Support and Accountability is a program that's run across the UK, across Canada, across parts of the Americas, and we have one program in Australia. But it is a great program that offers some of that, but is not really politically viable because it's seen as a soft response, right? And we have this community that wants to be punitive on offenders, and we have families and victim survivors that are like, that's actually my uncle, my brother, and I don't want to throw out their humanity with their offending. It's a difficult balance to strike, but there needs to be political will and respect for victim survivors when they say, you know, we need punishment, but we need punishment that's embedded in accountability, and that accountability needs to lead to change and changed behaviours. But if we're going to do that, we need to give people hope that there is an identity they can step into which moves beyond just this is the thing that defines me for the rest of my life.
So, we're all nodding furiously because it's just a beautiful articulation of what would be, I think, something that would resonate with everybody. Why is it that governments know what to do? I'm quoting Renee, governments know what they need to do, but they don't do it.
I'm going to say because there is a lot of misinformation. It comes down to a number of things. There's a lot of misinformation in the community about what it means to actually work with people and whether change is possible and what victim survivors actually want. also, you know, your policy cycle is 3 years, and a lot of these programs take much more than 3 years to demonstrate that they are effective and meaningful. They cost money that doesn't necessarily directly result in vote. You know, tough and crime is a great driver of votes, and getting serious about actually fixing the problems is, you know, probably, you know, we see the changes now in even youth justice, where we're going back to a not detention as last resort, but, you know, this idea of community safety, but in that there's a lot more harm that's generated. And so that I think that they don't do it because it's not politically savvy, which means we have to get it politically savvy, which means we need to change community perspectives, and we need to be driving around that, because pragmatically, until you can get votes in it, I mean, it's just not going to happen, unfortunately, on the scale that it needs to.
Yeah. What's your thoughts on that, Renee? Because you did raise that before around, you know, governments know the law reform commission, etc.
I mean,
doing it. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with everything Jodi just said. I think the other thing that often gets in the way is that it's seen as an expensive option, restorative justice, because maybe it takes a while, it might be resource intensive. But I suppose from a personal experience, you know, as someone who did counselling for years and years with victim survivors and then has moved into, you know, facilitating potentially a 2 to 3 hour conversation with the leader of an institution that's responsible for the harm, and they are able to tell their story, they're able to receive a really personalised, meaningful, genuine apology, they're able to contribute to cultural change within that institution. And I walked away from those conversations and I'm like, that is efficient. That's actually cost effective in terms of, you know, that and I just felt, I was like, oh, more has happened in that 2 hour conversation than I could have done in 2 years of counsel. And so I think there's a sort of a false economy sort of thought also in terms of what it costs.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so Hanina, you've talked, I think, quite really compassionately, really, about the dilemma that's faced, particularly First Nations victims and survivors, about the kind of impact if they make a decision to go down into the legal system. And you know, but I was hoping to draw this question sort of more broadly from the First Nations community, and think more broadly around, you know, what about when there are people who are really do need, you know, that the community does need to be protected from them, that they are not in that this hope for change, or the really little modicum I think that Jodi talked about of understanding that they need to take some accountability is not there. You know, does restorative approaches the right ones for that group of people, and how would we know?
I think it's about trial and error, but also I think from a historical point of view, Aboriginal people are the longest living culture in the world. We've been here for quite a long time, and we've thrived for many years prior to colonisation. I think we have the answers. And I know, not every community is the same across Australia, but we most definitely would be able to deal with these issues if we had the correct amount of resources. I mean, if these resources are, instead of going into building more prisons or building more detention centres or useless submarines, I think this money could be most definitely redirected towards resourcing, community-led programs and services that address these root causes of violence and the harms that have happened. I think that there's so much that we could do with well-funded services.
And there is so much that we could learn from the healing approaches, I think, of the First Nations communities for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know when a few years back when I was working at another organisation, we ran cultural camps for stolen gem survivors of child sexual abuse. And we found that these camps were absolutely healing for every member that attended, and also led to our staff working through our own traumas and our own issues that we may be dealing with as well. I mean, it's about working together as a collective and a community, and through art, through dance, through music. I think that there is most definitely healing through that, and doing it together and not in isolation.
And it goes to that point, someone said, and I'm losing track, I think it was Jodi, that, relationships can be harmful, but they can also be healing. And or healing can be found in relationships. And I think that's what you're talking about. I'm noticing the time, and I just want this to keep going, right? But anyway, we can't do that, and we know that people are pressured for time. It would be really useful to draw, use these last minutes to draw together, some advice for those who are listening, and also, and advice maybe for the National Centre about how we take some of these thoughts forward. So I'm going to come around to each person and ask you to sort of summarise what you've heard and what you would like people to hear from you. And I would like to start with Malika, and just what you'd like people to take away from this conversation, and what you're taking away.
I would like the abuse to stop. I would like survivors just to be listened to and believed. But just listening to what Hanina said as well, I love the idea that there could be healing camps or healing spas where people could just go and know that they're going to be supported and believed, and that they could go through whatever is available, whether it's counseling or art or dance or music or cooking, gardening, just places, centers where you could just go and heal. But as far as what we're talking about today, yeah, I would love to see more advocates of child abuse that could support survivors to help them navigate this really convoluted and deeply flawed justice system that we do have in Australia.
Is there something that's, before you go, is there something that stands out, from this conversation that was something new that you hadn't thought about before?
I don't know if it's new. I mean, I do love the idea what Hanina said as well about, a camp. I think healing camps would be great. I think the restorative justice would be great. It just comes down to the bottom line that we need our government to stop funding war machines and to start funding communities, and to support all families, because, as well as Jodi said, it's not black and white, and what survivors need changes, and what makes a perpetrator offend is, varies. And so this is a great conversation, but it's just the beginning of what we need.
Yeah. Malika, thank you. Renee, what are your thoughts in what you've heard, what you take away, and what you'd like people to take away?
So in terms of what I'd like people to take away, I suppose something around just taking their own time to think through, reflect, what would justice mean to them, and knowing that whatever form that takes, if it's a conversation with the person that's hurt you, that's normal. It's not weird. It's not, we have lots of people that come talk to us and they're like, oh, is this weird that I want to do, whatever it is, it's absolutely understandable. And just to kind of follow that train for you, see where it takes you. That there are people out there that can kind of support that journey in whatever form it takes. And I think there's all work that we can be doing sort of as the service sector to be really kind of advocating for more restorative pathways and legislation that really protects these conversations and makes them more accessible.
More advocacy. What about you, Hanina? What have you heard, and what would you like people to hear today?
Yeah, to echo everything that Renee and Malika said. I think we, speaking as a lawyer, I think to other lawyers, your approach should be, when you are speaking to a survivor of abuse, to approach that person with compassion and empathy, don't rush things because you're on the clock. That's not the way to approach anybody, for that matter. And understand the layers upon layers that Aboriginal survivors have when they are coming to you, knowing that this is a racist colonial system, and knowing that going to these systems could mean life or death, or complete disbelief and rejection and further racism. So I think that's, you know, a key take home that I would like people to think about and keep at the back of their mind all the time. And yeah, hoping that we can live in a non-violent society that doesn't need these types of systems, you know, anymore, and we can, you know, have work together towards collective healing.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Hanina. Jodi.
I have three things.
Oh, go for it.
My first thing is, Hanina is absolutely right. We have so many lessons that we can learn from First Nations peoples, and the notion that trauma is dealt with collectively as community, and it's dealt with through ceremony and dance and connection. And you know, the trauma research is showing the mind-body community connection is so important for actually addressing trauma, and that's the trauma that leads to perpetration and the traumas that's a result of perpetration. So we need to learn those lessons and work closely with First Nations communities, not only to empower them, but to translate some of those lessons into, you know, the colonial systems, which need to just be fundamentally dismantled. The second point that I want to say is, in terms of government, that what works is far more important than ego or bravado or systems. What works for victim survivors is often far more closely aligned to what perpetrators need than we think, and we need to get real about that and seriously get over ourselves and stop investing the obscene amounts of monies we invest in carceral systems and start redistributing them through the things that we know that prevents reoffending and prevents offending in the first place: education, health, child protection, meaningfully dealing with communities. And the third thing that I would say to victim survivors is 1 in 3 girls and somewhere between 1 in 4 and 9 boys are seriously sexually assaulted before they turn 18. There are a lot of us out there. There are a lot of survivors that are existing in communities, doing life, struggling, and there are a lot of that have found a way to get to a position in life. And you are not alone. And find your people. And we need to have the courage to continue to talk about our experiences and to talk about and find ways to amplify each other's voices and find ways to amplify each other's courage and dignity. And together we can do really exciting things, but you're not alone and you don't need to be in isolation.
Thank you, Jodi. Can I just underline that one of the experiences that I've had in coming into the National Centre, and for those who don't know, it's only a couple of years old. It's a newish centre really in the scheme of things. And one of the great privileges that I've had is to have people who are living in the community have not connected up with a community of victims and survivors, who feel like with the National Centre and the capacity to link in, they aren't alone anymore. But actually, you know, there is also the sorts of groups and community sort of groups that Malika's spoken about, that she's connected with in her local community and so on, that, you know, are there. But this idea of find your people, can you say a bit more about that, Jodi? Because, you know, I think that's one of the things that's coming through today is like, well, where and how and where do I start? Can you say a bit more about that?
Well, firstly, I think we should stop assuming that somebody hasn't been sexually assaulted, because particularly we know for women, but also for men, the levels are so significant that you know, it's highly likely that people that are around you have experienced some form of sexual assault or harassment. And if we stop assuming that and we start treating people in ways that recognize the potential for that harm, then we will take a different approach to each other. And that doesn't, you know, mean the condescending rubbish, but it means the thoughtfulness and compassion and being bold in the willingness to have the conversations of what you've experienced. It means doing the things that give you joy and connection that are not necessarily directly related to your experiences of sexual violence, but can be healing. And it means, oh gosh, having the courage to get out there. And as an introvert who loves nothing more than sitting alone on my lounge with my beloved, that's really challenging, and it's really scary, and it's really difficult. But you don't actually need a whole community of people. What you need is, some people need a whole community, some people need one or two people, and it varies widely. But unless you are either out there virtually in internet world, or you're out there engaging in, you know, the local groups at your libraries that's about, you know, reading a book a month, or is about joining an art class, or whatever it is, just start building those connections somewhere. And as much as I hate the kind of ridiculous analogies, it's easier to steer a boat that's moving than one that's in the dock. So get moving and have courage, and understand that there will be setbacks, but good God, you've made it this far. You have survived. Keep surviving and keep searching.
Thank you, Jodi. It's such a great place to draw things together. I just want to check with the others, you know, how do people find their tribe? Taking a word from the chat. Now, how do people find their tribe? We've heard from Jodi, encouragement to do so. Hanina, how do people find their community? What advice do you have to people about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's different for different people. I think working with Stolen Gen and people who were removed from multiple countries across Australia, I think, you know, the types of environments that we were creating were, you know, open to all, you know, people from various mobs. So in that sense, you know, we're not, we're always going to have open arms and have that ability to meet all kinds of people who are looking to heal from trauma. I think it's a trial and error thing. You have to be willing to kind of put yourself out there, and it is scary, you know, for any of us, even as adults. I think, yeah, in our 40s or whatever, it can be very intimidating and difficult, but sometimes finding just one person can be enough. So yeah, being brave, it's not easy. Easier said than done.
Yeah. Renee, any other additional advice?
Only, I suppose, if part of your kind of tribe might be professional support, if you feel like, you know, you've gone to counselling and it has felt not quite right, or it hasn't worked, the problem is not you. It might be that the counsellor sucked. And I think often we think that it could never be the counsellor that's bad. It must be you. Anyway, you are not the problem. So go find a different one, and one that makes sense to you, one that you feel like you click with, and that you feel safe and that someone gets it. And sometimes the right counsellor is like kind of trying to find the right pair of jeans. It can take a while to try on a few until you find the right one, and then, yeah.
Thank you. Very wise advice, Malika.
Yeah,
How do you find your tribe?
I think sometimes you have to be your tribe. A big thing that I feel is that we need to release any shame, because I know that shame is one of the biggest crippling factors in seeking our tribe, because we think that we've done something wrong. The counsellor that I did get, one good thing she said to me was to treat myself, or the little me inside, with the love that I would give those that I love the most. So, you know, the love that I had for my kids, I was able to at some stage reflect back into myself and go, oh, I can give that to myself as well. So sometimes, you know, you have to be your tribe and your mob. But again, like Hanina said, it might just be one or two people, but to be authentic and to be brave, drop the shame, you know, and know that you're worthy of love. And And I think that your tribe will, hopefully you'll find them, or just putting it out online. Luckily with the internet, we've got so many groups that we can, reach out to. So just be kind. I think being kind to yourself is the most important thing. Be your first number one tribe.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to draw us together to a close there, because I think, we started on the difficult legal system, and we are getting to, well, really it's about you and what you want and you need, and draw people around. So, we are coming to the end, and I've always been given permission to kind of think about how we close off the end of these conversations as we go. We would be really pleased to have your feedback about, this conversation and what you've heard and what you'd like to see in future. We've had a lot of commentary in the chat, which has been fantastic, both comments about what's being said, but also questions. And I know that we haven't got to all of those, so we just recognise that and encourage let you know that we've got a team who's looking at all of that, and will respond potentially with some of our both future planning around our conversations, but also the training and the resourcing that we provide. There is a conversation like this every month. Our next one is later in May. And so you can just drop back, there you go. It's about what helps and hinders healing after child sexual abuse. This is a group that will be presenting this conversation, who all of them will have lived experience and will have perspectives to share. So we're pretty honoured to have that one scheduled. We'll also encourage you to give us some feedback. If you're able to, on our survey, which is there, you can scan it with your phones, or it will obviously get emailed out to you. We would also like to let you know that we are going to commence a policy coalition, which is drawing together some of these sorts of ideas that we hear in these conversations, that we hear from the many, many people, as Jodi identified, who are living with an experience of child sexual abuse, and start to look at ways that the National Centre might continue to build advocacy and discussions in community about changes that we would like to see. So if you're interested in knowing more about a policy coalition and policy thinking that we might be doing, you can certainly get in touch with us at our info contact, or policy coalition at National Centre, and we'll keep you posted about that. I'm just checking to see, there's obviously lots of comments in the chat, but I'm going to draw it to an end, because I think what we've done is come around to the individuals and individuals' needs and individuals' experiences, and the humanity of community and connection, which is a really important strength and positive strength in what we've heard from everybody today. Thank you so much, Jodi, Malika, Renee and Hanina, for your wisdom and for bringing your experience and your lived expertise to the table. It's been awesome. We're all going to go and look up that Scottish justice stuff, Jodi. But I encourage everyone to keep in touch with the National Centre and what we're learning and sharing with you. And can I just go back and thank our panel for today and the team who's put together the conversation. See you next time, folks.